And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi there, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Tuesday, February 18th, 2025. And starting with the sea ice of note, we are going to see strengthening winds along areas, especially west coast along the north side of St. Lawrence Island up through the Seward Peninsula, Bering Strait, and Lisburne Peninsula. Those areas there will see gale force winds of 35 to 40 knots that could not only cause blowing and drifting snow and reduced visibility, but also shifting of ice. And the tendency as we develop more of these offshore flows that some of this ice could try to drift back toward the west here through midweek. Otherwise, we still have some ice here in areas of Bristol Bay and as we get up along the northern or upper portion of Cook Inlet. But we are going to be seeing warmer temperatures develop across the Gulf Coast and push up into the southeast mainland as we go through the end of the weekend. The storm pattern has shifted out. It started this past weekend, as I was telling you about, and anticipated, and that's already happening. We're getting the lows back up into the Gulf. Some of the lows then are also going to be pulling back up into the Bering. There's a frontal system that's stalled northern and western portions of the mainland. That feature will begin to wash out as we go through Wednesday into Thursday. But this low, as it weakens toward Prince William Sound, will bring some additional precipitation along the Gulf Coast, mainly rain, snow as you get up in elevation. But by the time we get into Wednesday, there'll be another low in front approaching the Gulf, and this will have more in the way of moisture and have more impact as we go through the day Thursday, especially Thursday, later afternoon, evening, into early Friday. And there's that front. It'll be pushing more rain along the lower elevation and coastal areas at sea level of the Panhandle along the Gulf Coast. And as we get into Friday, there will be yet another system pulling up into the Gulf, but we are also going to see a ridge of high pressure, fairly strong in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere, building up over the Gulf and up into the along the Alcan border. So this is going to allow warmer temperatures to take hold over much of south central, southeast Alaska. So going into Wednesday, southeast winds 15 knots, Metlakatla up through Petersburg, waves 3 to as high as 6-7 feet here in Dixon Entrance. Northwest winds 10 knots, Lynn Canal, couple of foot waves because we do have this front pulling up. And as we get south of the front, winds will be south-southwest 15 knots, Sitka down through and off of Craig. But to the north of it, stronger winds, upwards of 35 knot gales outside of the Icy Strait to outside of Yakutat Bay to Cape Suckling with waves of 10 to 12 feet. Now on Thursday, another front will be approaching from the south. So with the initial push north, we could see south-southeast winds gusting upwards of 35 knots here, Dixon Entrance and up here through Stevens Passage, but still north winds along here of Lynn Canal with 3-foot waves. For areas south of Sitka and off of Craig, we're looking at 35 knot southerly gales. As we go northward, those winds turn more easterly with perhaps 35 knot gales coming out of there, the Icy Strait area, and then 25 to 30 knot easterly winds outside of Yakutat Bay and Cape Suckling. For the northwestern Gulf, first upper Cook Inlet, northeast winds 15 knots. We're looking at 20 to 25 knots, middle Cook Inlet down through into lower Cook Inlet, including Kamishak Bay. Northeast winds 10 knots within Prince William Sound, but outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, we're looking at east-northeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Those winds are going to come up on Thursday with that approaching low to the south, and we expect outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, winds of 30 to 35 knots, 14-foot waves along the eastern Kenai down to just northeast of Kodiak Island. Northeasterly gales to 40 knots, and then for lower Cook Inlet, northeast gales of 35 knots, especially in through the wider expanse just in toward the middle there near Kamishak Bay and west of Homer. And the outlook for Kodiak Island Wednesday, look for southeast to easterly winds of 25 to 30 knots along the North Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, generally easterly winds of 30 knots, waves 8 to 10 feet, and then from Bristol Bay down through north of Cold Bay, we're looking at east-southeast winds at 25 knots. On Thursday, with low pressure just off of Kodiak Island, we're looking at within Shelikof Strait northeasterly gales of 40 knots and 10-foot waves. And around Kodiak Island, generally northeast winds of 30 knots on the east side and south of there. As we go out of Kuskokwim or out of Bristol Bay, 20-knot northeast winds, and then the winds become more variable here as you get down toward the eastern Aleutians. So either side of Cold Bay, Falls Pass, generally winds around 10 knots and variable. Waves highest 12 feet or so off of Sand Point, only 4 to 5 feet there on the Bering side. For the eastern Aleutians, to start out, we're looking at northwest to north winds around 20 knots, eastern and central Aleutians on Wednesday. As you get further west of Adak through Kiska and Shemya, northeasterly winds 25 to 30 knots, strongest west of Kiska. And then for Thursday, generally speaking, westerly winds around 10 knots, may even be a bit variable south of Atka. And as you get out toward Kiska and Shemya, winds are northwest at 20 knots, so relatively light by Aleutian standards. Along the southwest and west coast, though, we have for Wednesday easterly winds of 30 knots there within Bristol Bay, northeast winds of 30 knots out of Kuskokwim Bay, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots, the Pribilofs up through St. Matthew, and then along areas of the lower Yukon Delta, including out of Norton Sound, northeast winds around 25 knots. So again, that ice will have a tendency to want to push back toward the west and maybe even south a bit. And then on Thursday, winds might not be quite as strong, but still 25 knots out of Bristol Bay from the northeast, 15-knot winds from the northeast out of Kuskokwim Bay. And then out of Norton Sound, still 25-knot northeasterly winds, but down along the lower Yukon Delta, 20-knot northeasterly winds, strongest winds in the vicinity of St. Matthew, northeast gales to 35 knots. Now, the strongest winds of anywhere are going to be occurring through the Chukchi Sea, Bering Strait, and especially north side of St. Lawrence Island. There will be blizzard or near blizzard conditions at times due to the blowing snow. Also, ice could shift. Plenty is open up along areas of the shoreline, but we're looking at 35 to 40 knot north to northeast gales, especially from Point Lay across the Chukchi Sea coastline down through the Bering Strait to the north side of St. Lawrence Island. Further off to the north and east, winds from Kaktovik through Utqiagvik should generally be out of the northeast at just 10 knots. And then on Thursday, those winds do come up a bit along the Beaufort Sea coast, east to northeast winds 20 knots, Kaktovik through Utqiagvik. As we begin to come down along the Chukchi Sea coast, winds increase, especially off of Point Lay and Cape Lisburne. We're looking at gales upwards of 40 knots there. Again, there could be a continuation of blowing snow and some shifting of ice. As we drop down through the lower Chukchi Sea, through the Bering Strait, northeast to north winds at 30 knots, and as high as 40 knots there on the west side of St. Lawrence Island in the vicinity of Gamble. We're anticipating on Thursday northerly gales to 40 knots.